I think I maybe didn't think I was going to become less liberal or more American. I think that really did strike me by surprise.
Hello, and welcome to the official podcast from the Hart and Currie magazine, an independent publication dedicated to bringing you the most compelling stories of our time. I'm Jean-Luc Currie, co-founder of the Hart and the Currie and your host today. Today our guest is Danny Zimny-Schmitt. Danny, what's up? Potentially the youngest person to ever visit all 3,143 counties in America, which you did by the age of 30. Yes, so that means for all of you listening to the podcast today, if you were born in the United States, Danny has actually visited your county. So hi, Danny. Welcome in.
Hi, Jean-Luc. Thanks for having me.
Maybe to get us started, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself. So where were you born? Where do you live now? And what's your current occupation?
Yeah, of course. I grew up, born and raised in the city of Chicago. I'm a 14-year product of Chicago Public Schools. And probably unsurprisingly, I had a fascination from a very young age with everything related to trains, bicycles, running, and kind of all these kind of the childhood of what you would imagine a traveler wanderlust kind of guy might have. I moved to Denver to attend school at the University of Denver. Got an internship my senior year, working at a lab focused on renewable energy, and I have basically been in Colorado ever since, even though I make frequent trips back to the Midwest to see family and friends.
And what did you study in undergrad?
I studied environmental science in undergrad, but geography for my master's degree.
Okay,
So
perfect. Which I think is very prescient to the conversation we're going to be having today.
yes, I think so.
We'll also be publishing your article that you wrote about your travels, something we'll be talking today in our July edition of the magazine. So the first question I think you get asked is, and that you wrote about in your essay, is why? What prompted you to do it, and what is it?
Sure. I think I like to think about this in two different ways. I think there was the traveler in me that kind of maybe always existed since I was in middle school or younger. I was planning our family vacation starting in when I was in 5th grade. And so part of it was just a kind of a logical extension of growing up and wanting to see more and more of this country that I call home. And familiarizing myself with trains, like I mentioned, with buses and planes as I got older, all played a role in kind of feeding this kind of want to travel, want to learn. I think the second part really veers away perhaps from the wanderlust a little bit and more in the want to learn and understand more. Growing up in Chicago and then coming to Denver for school and for work, I was always kind of surrounded by people who generally lean left politically, and I think that the 2016 election results really shocked me as they did all my friends and family, and I made a conscious effort to kind of want to understand maybe things about my country that I didn't know beforehand. So part of this was a conscious attempt to learn from people and from places that I hadn't interacted much over the course of my, at that point, 22-year long life.
So 3,143 counties by the age of 30 is absolutely no small feat. If the first question you get asked is why, I assume, and when we met, the second question I asked you is how. How did you do it? I think one of the assumptions people make when they hear your story is that you might have had an unlimited pot of money that you could dip into, and you could just sort of gallivant around and travel whenever, wherever you needed. But maybe give us a little bit of an overview of how you thought about this, how you structured it, and what kind of budget you were on.
Yeah, of course. So I think I perhaps started my senior year of undergrad when I was taking a field course with a professor who casually mentioned.
What does it mean to be in a field course in geography?
It means that you are out in the field, maybe camping every night, excavating soil sediments and cores from bogs in western Colorado,
Okay.
visiting national parks and learning about the natural history and the landscape
Okay.
as much as the human history. So the professor for this course just kind of casually mentioned around the campfire one night that he keeps track of every county he's ever visited. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So after the course concluded, I went home and I printed off a map with all the different county boundaries on it instead of your state boundaries, and just kind of colored in with a highlighter everywhere I had ever been. Found that I had been to maybe, I don't know, 500, 600 counties, which is, a decent amount around the Midwest and the West, but nowhere's near the 3,143. And so I attended grad school afterward. I majored in geography in grad school. I went to a geography conference right around the end of my grad school career, which kind of inspired me to, perhaps learn a little bit more about the places I didn't know. By then, it was 2019. I had turned 25. I had a full-time job, and I finally had kind of the time and the resources to perhaps make this a goal, and something that I could focus on. For, I guess, going off of that, I guess we should talk about the budget a little bit. I set a very ambitious budget of about $10 per county visited, and so a lot of times I would think about this in terms of, if I have, say, a free weekend or a long weekend or a few days when I can go ahead and do this, I would think about, okay, what would the airfare be to fly to Dallas versus Nashville versus Charlotte? How much are the rental cars in each of these respective cities? How many counties can I feasibly see in the time between my flight arrival and flight departure? And so there was a lot of I guess strategic planning, a lot of time on Google Maps, plotting out different routes with counties overlaid, just to see how many counties I could see in between that time.
So from your senior year in high school, how many counties?
College. Yeah.
From your senior year in college, how many counties had you visited at that point? So you're 22.
Yeah, or maybe around like 500.
Maybe
or
around
so.
like 500.
By the time I got to the kind of end of grad school, I had turned 25. I was old enough to rent a car. By then, I had reached about 1,000, so about 30% of the total.
So you still had over 2,000 counties to visit.
Yes.
When you really got aggressive about this.
Yes.
What was your total spend from the time you started tracking it to visit all these counties?
It was somewhere in the $20,000 range. So
about
that's kind of
25,000.
4.5 years intensive from mid 2019 till the end of 2023.
Which I think we were talking beforehand, doing a little bit of math, and that works out to roughly about $11 a county is what you ended up spending in total.
Yeah, more or less.
But some places were more expensive than others.
Yep.
So maybe tell us about, in particular, Hawaii and Alaska. How many counties are in Hawaii? How many counties are in Alaska? How did you visit all the counties in both of those places?
Sure. So very different stories. Hawaii only has 5 counties, and they are conveniently each located kind of on their own island. And you can fly, pretty directly on Hawaiian Airlines, Southwest Airlines, between them. And it's also just a very pleasant place to visit. So I kind of tagged on to one of my friend's spring break trips out that way and spent about a week and explored a little bit and checked off all of those 5 counties. Alaska was really where the tough got going. I had been on a trip in high school with my mom and grandma where we had cruised through the southeastern Alaska, stopped in a few ports there, tracked the counties through there retrospectively, and also visited Denali. So I had a bit of a base. I think I had maybe 12 out of those 30 counties in Alaska by the time I had decided I wanted to try to visit every county in the United States. And so I went back to visit some national parks with my mom in Alaska during the summer of 2021. So after a week kind of traveling around with her, driving the Dalton Highway up to Gates of the Arctic, flying over to Lake Clark, collecting obviously all the counties along the way, I was left with about 10 counties that were disconnected from the road network, were going to be very, very hard to get to, but that I strategically had planned around getting an Alaska Airlines credit card sign-up bonus, and using that to kind of fund a lot of these flights to and from Anchorage to kind of do almost like a whistle stop tour of different places in rural Alaska. I got a weekly rate at a motel down in Anchorage, and pretty much every morning I'd wake up, I'd take the bus to the Anchorage airport, fly off to Nome or Kodiak Island or wherever it was for that day, and came back to Anchorage every night. The Anchorage airport really is the transportation hub for the entire state, is something I learned. And after about 2 weeks there, I had completely checked off all 30 counties in Alaska.
These remote counties that you were flying to, were people surprised when you showed up?
Yeah, I flew to St. Mary's, which is in the Kusilvac borough, if you're keeping track at home. And on the way back, I was sitting next to a gentleman who worked for the FAA, who was very curious about why I might be flying back from St. Mary's. He was wondering if I knew somebody in town, because it's not a place where tourists go or outsiders often visit. And I explained that I was actually trying to travel to every county in the United States, and he entertained me with stories about how he's in charge of some runway safety in rural Alaska, and how oftentimes they have to charter planes for him to visit these remote airports to deal with lighting or other concerns on these runways. So it was just a really interesting way to meet someone, an entirely different walk of life than I was in.
Your trip reminds me of two books. One by James and Deborah Fallows called Our Towns, which was written probably about 6 or 7 years ago, and is the story of their journey as they flew, their pilots, as they flew their plane to the forgotten places of America. So they flew to a lot of Rust Belt towns that might have been booming in the 40s and 50s, but had sort of hollowed out. They flew to a lot of Midwest towns, places in the South, interior towns in California, things like that, with the intent of finding out what was going on in the heartland of America. It also reminds me of a book by John Steinbeck, Travels with Charlie, where he retrofits a truck basically into an RV, packs up his poodle Charlie, and takes this multi-month road trip around the country, starting in Maine, ends up going all the way to California, down through Texas, through the South. And part of his thing was he felt like he lived in a New York bubble. And as he says in the book, New York is no more America than London is England or Paris is France. And he felt like as a writer, it was really important for him to understand America and to understand the people in America. And he felt like for 25 years, he had been extremely disconnected from it. Your trip reminds me of that in many ways. And what John Steinbeck saw when he was traveling decades ago now, 50 years ago, I think is very similar to some of the things you write about in your essay and that you saw as well. In particular, an urban-rural divide. We talk a lot about polarization and the Republican-liberal divide. Did you see those divides at work in the country, and are they one-to-one? Do they overlap? Is the urban and rural divide the same thing as the Republican and liberal divide in the country?
The short answer is increasingly so. I think we are increasingly seeing political polarization follow those urban-rural lines. I don't think it has always been that way. I think about as recently as the Obama years, when he won a lot of counties in the heartland, of which Trump won most of them in 2016 and 2020. So I think there is a lot of rural-urban tension in the country right now that was very much visible on the landscape. I did a lot of driving the summer of 2020, and a lot of times it was the Trump signs competing with the Biden signs, depending on where you were. I think there's a lot of places that feel very one-sided, and you can kind of look around and tell everyone's probably going to vote the same way. There are other places that are a little bit more mixed. And so I think if you think about if urban is voting for Democrats and rural areas are voting for Republicans, like for the most part, there are those, those ex-urban areas. There are those lower density suburban areas that kind of cross the line between easy categorization. Maybe the folks who live out there they have jobs in the city and they commute in just like a lot of suburbanites do. But they also, the reason they chose to live there was because they wanted a piece of land. They wanted a little bit more of that kind of life in the country experience. So it's a little bit hard to categorize them as completely on one side of the divide or the other. So I do think there's a lot of middle ground in that question.
Is it new? Is the urban-rural divide new? Like, is this a new phenomenon?
No, this is not. Some of the reading I did, just out of my own interest in trying to understand some of the things I saw on this trip, pointed back to urban-rural divides going back to ancient Rome. So I think it's nothing new. I think it always changes. It changes flavor and variety depending on who the the constitution of the political parties and the leaders are of whatever state along the way. But I do think that there's often a pronounced urban-rural divide because of different ways of making a living, different ways of livelihoods. I think it's always going to create kind of some tension in every society.
So how were you raised politically?
So I grew up in Chicago,
Yep.
and I was very much a kind of a product of growing up in a fairly liberal family. I listened to a lot of NPR growing up. I read some newspapers. In college, I got involved with some of the more left-leaning political causes on campus. So I think I kind of had this one-sided bubble. So you mentioned John Steinbeck. Living in New York for 25 years, you feel a little bit like you've perhaps not experienced the full range of America. I think I very much came to recognize that after the 2016 election, and I was someone who maybe thought of myself as very worldly or well-traveled or well-read, and felt that perhaps I had missed something in light of that, in light of that election, and perhaps there was more for me to learn out there, and I wanted to make a conscious effort to try to do that.
Could you talk a little bit about how this trip then affected those political beliefs that you were raised with, or that you were indoctrinated into in the bubble that you lived in?
Yeah, of course.
Chicago.
I would say the trip kind of made me something of a radical moderate, is the word I like to use. I think there's a lot of energy at both far ends of the political spectrum, and I think we need to bring some of that energy to the middle, to people who maybe want to see our country brought back from the fringes that it feels like we're on a lot of times. I think it taught me that there are different ways and realities that people make a living. There are different ways in which geography affects the way people vote, and the way they view their own lives, they view the context of their lives in the greater country. So I think one of the biggest things it did is taught me that maybe there isn't a singular way or singular party that's right about everything. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle, and that perhaps both political parties, when they're forced to compromise with each other, will lead to better outcomes than if we had one-sided rule from either side.
Danny, you talk about traveling a significant portion of this trip, this adventure. What do you call it? Adventure trip?
Adventure, exploration.
Exploration,
maybe.
Okay. This exploration after 2016, so you talked about how you were kind of shocked at the outcome of the 2016 election. So you traveled a lot during the Trump years. And so I've been interested both in the essay and in the conversations we've had to see how many people after 2016 actually dug in their political beliefs. But it seems to me that you actually moderated. In essence, you were moving against the tide. If you can, I'd like you to read an excerpt from your essay, and then I have a follow-up question from that.
Yeah. Most of the books I'd read in high school and college were either solidly left or center-left in their orientation. While this reading menu fit nicely into my social situations at the time, not to mention the prevailing attitudes of the Obama years, I found that the authors on the center-right now had perspectives which were incredibly helpful in helping me to better understand the places where I now found myself. Reading about familiar political issues, whether taxes on small businesses or immigration reform or the murky lines separating church and state, from a point of view I had previously dismissed out of hand, fostered more critical political thinking than I'd ever done before. In the same week, I might listen to books from voices as diverse as Naomi Klein and Ben Shapiro, or Howard Zinn and Helen Pluckrose. How few other people shared my thirst to learn from both sides wasn't lost on me. This potent combination of traveling and reading coalesced into a remarkable moderation of my political opinions over the course of a year when it seemed that everyone else was digging in their heels and writing off the other side as a group of crazies at best or blood enemies at worst.
You say a potent combination of the travel and the reading. How did, or why? Why do you think this travel and the reading, the combination of both, affected your political beliefs so much, brought you into a place of moderation, and built so much empathy for Americans who were raised so differently from you?
I think it's easy to hold people at arm's length when you only read about them theoretically. It's a little bit different when they're the one perhaps serving you coffee that morning, or they're the ones that you interact with at the gas station. I think there's a humanization factor that comes in to seeing people face to face, to saying good morning to them, to asking them how their day is going, that is lost when you are perhaps reading a book at home, watching the evening news. You might see their faces, but they're through a screen. I think there's a human element, a human connection that is missed in those moments. And I think the empathy part you mentioned, I think it's always easier to empathize with people you have already spent a little bit of time humanizing and trying to understand than trying to think about empathy in this theoretical sense.
But why did being physically there help change your beliefs? Did it? Did being physically proximate in a place and seeing things firsthand, the way people were living, why did that have such a massive effect? Because one of the things we see right now, right? We both live in Denver, fairly blue and getting more blue by the year, and classified, as a fairly urban area, or LA, New York City, Seattle. These are staunchly urban areas where people don't interact with a huge swath of the American population that you went out of your way to interact with for 7 or 8 years. And so what did being there do? How did the combination of the travel and the reading both impact one another?
Yeah, well, I think they work together. I think the reading inspired me to travel and learn about the places I read about, and the traveling inspired me to take up a book and read about a place that I felt like I passed through too quickly and didn't understand. It also just made me rethink, I would say, some of the assumptions I had held. I'll give you a great example. I was driving through the thumb of Michigan along Lake Huron during the summer of 2020. And being raised in Chicago, I had always been taught that the Democrats are the party of the working class, and the Republicans don't like poor people, and they back policies that discriminate against them. And so it was very odd to me to see on the ground as I drove this road along the lake that all of the nice lakefront houses on the lake side of this state highway had their Biden signs all lined up, and all of the properties on the other side of the highway had their Trump signs lined up, which it was a bit the opposite of what I maybe had been taught, had been thought to expect in this type of kind of situation where class was evident on the landscape.
You also traveled a significant amount of the strip during the pandemic. So how did the pandemic affect your travels?
Yeah, I would say there are two things in trying to understand America politically and socially. When I was in, let's say, in more conservative rural areas, it was almost as if the pandemic didn't happen. No one was wearing masks. I'd go to grocery stores. I'd stop. You were allowed to eat in restaurants. I tended to avoid that just because I didn't want to get sick on the road, and I was trying to avoid it if I could. Whereas in more liberal areas, things were very much different. Everyone was masked up in hotels, in supermarkets, just in any place I stopped. There were mask mandates, and so it was very clear from a just kind of at first glance, almost the way people were voting, whether they were wearing masks or not, or were they taking precautions? Were they outside the home? Were they working from home, or were they out working? And so the other thing that really had an effect was because so many fewer people were traveling, it honestly made it a little bit easier to travel because gas was at $1.25 a gallon. No one was renting cars. I got rental cars for $20 a day at some points. Airfares were very low. And so in some ways it made it a little bit easier just from a cost standpoint, but also because I was not allowed to go into the office for 2 years. So
So you had the time.
so I had more time. I would stop along the way. I'd take my meetings. I'd do some work. I'd drive through 5 more counties, and then I would stop again and do some work. So this kind of flexibility that I was lucky enough to have with my job made the kind of gigantic task of trying to visit everywhere a lot more doable. I would say it sped up my process from a lifelong goal into a goal I might reasonably finish in my 20s.
So the tail end of the Trump years coincided with the pandemic. So you were traveling during the 2020 election, and you write in the essay that you were able to predict the outcome of the election much more accurately than most pollsters. Why was that?
I think polls they're useful tools. I think when you have nothing else to go off of, they're the best tool we have to predict outcomes of elections. But I think a lot of times what you see on the landscape isn't necessarily borne out in the polls. Sometimes I felt that I was driving through a state and there was so much like outward support for Trump. I'm like, how can Biden be up by 9 points in the state? It makes no sense. Or vice versa. So I think there was a lot of I informed myself with polls and looked almost for ground truthing validation as I was driving through. And it was a little bit of a feel situation. It's like, well, I could believe this number or maybe I can't. I think part of this has to do with my, having a background in geography. I might know what to look for a little bit more. I'm familiar with how urban and rural and suburban states are, and being able to read whether the number of Trump signs or Biden signs I might see in the suburbs might correspond to flips in the polling data.
Did any places surprise you?
I found the upper Midwest to be far more Trump supporting in 2020 as far as the landscape and signs went than I was expecting. Biden, won back all of the Rust Belt states that that Hillary lost in 2016, but it was still very close. And so I spent more time around the Midwest that summer, and so that was one of the most important things I learned.
Switching gears a little bit, this is a huge undertaking. Visiting all 3,143 counties in the United States is a massive task. Did you at any point ever feel overwhelmed or like this was too daunting, too much?
Yeah, I think there were some moments when I wondered why I was doing this, when I would wake up somewhere far away on the other side of the country and the group text was blowing up and I knew I wasn't going to be able to make the drinks or the happy hour that night. Had some doubts about, what exactly am I doing with my life here. I think there were some mornings when I had to wake up at 6 a.m. and hit the road by 6:30 because I had to hit 20 counties before the rental car was due and my flight left at an airport on the other side of the state, things like that. So I think there were moments of I'm not sure if doubt is the right word or just questioning myself of what am I doing here. But overall, you can only ever be in one county at once, and so it's like devouring a whale, right? It's like it's one bite at a time. It's like you slowly take steps towards your goal, and it doesn't really feel real until you get quite close to the end.
What were the different kinds of transportation that you took, and what were the experiences of those? How did those differ one from the other?
Yeah, so in most places, I did have to drive there. America does not have great intercity transportation options the way you might have in Europe or Japan. And so until I was old enough to rent a car at 25, most of the country really was kind of walled off to me. I did travel almost every mile of Amtrak route in the U.S. This was mostly done before I turned 25. So I often had my county map looking like it followed the Amtrak lines across the country. I had taken some Greyhound buses, mega buses, other types of ways to get around. But generally those travel on interstates, and they're well-traveled corridors to really get far away from the more populated places. You really needed to get onto some of these back roads, county highways, things like that, and that really did require a personal vehicle, or in most cases a rental vehicle. I drove my car out of Denver around the Northwest, the Southwest, the Midwest, but I wasn't going to drive all the way to Florida and back.
Did you notice any demographic differences between modes of travel?
Yeah, of course. I think not everyone is in a position to afford a car or drive a lot, but in rural areas you are often forced to. And so a lot of times in rural areas I did see people in cars that maybe didn't look like they were in the greatest shape. Look, they really needed a new car, but they had to drive because there was no other option. In urban areas, on these more well-traveled corridors that I mentioned, I think you got a great cross section of the population taking trains and buses. I think it really did look like I was traveling through America in these places. There was class diversity, there was racial diversity. And so you lose some of that when you are driving alone everywhere, and you don't necessarily get to interact with or see the drivers that you're passing on the highway.
You write in the essay, one of the first things I noticed as I spent more time driving on state and county roads was how effectively interstate highways function as tunnels to minimize interaction with the places that they pass through. In Travels with Charlie, John Steinbeck writes about something similar, about how there are main arteries that have kept us from and bypassed to certain areas in the country. Could you talk a little bit about your intentionality about why you chose to avoid interstates and stick to, in this case, state highways and backcountry roads?
Yeah, of course. I think along interstates they're kind of places of passage, not places of being as much. We see familiar hotel chains, we see familiar chain restaurants, we see familiar chain gas stations. You can drive across the country and experience very little that's new if you never get more than half a mile from the interstate you're traveling down. So I think a very short drive on a county road can teach you more than a 3,000 mile drive across America on I-80, for example.
What do you think we've lost as a result?
I think we have lost some of that genuine human interaction that used to happen. I think about the movie Cars from the 2000s, and that fictitious town of Radiator Springs that used to be on the main highway on Route 66, but now everyone took I-40 across Arizona instead. And so I think you kind of miss that kind of, whether it's that pocket of Americana or that being forced to interact with people who are living on those places in between, that we can now very effectively either tunnel through on the interstates or fly over. I think there's something lost when we are able to avoid interacting with so many people who are living in these places in between.
In the age of the internet, we can technically read about any place. I can read about the real equivalent of Radiator Springs in Arizona. I can read about all of these things, but you put yourself there physically. What do you think that unmediated experience, so not having the internet between you and physically being there, did for you or helped you discover?
Well, the internet was with me on my travels, and the fact that I would extensively plan out my turns and routes on Google Maps the week before or the night before. So I definitely did use it to kind of inform my journey. But I think when you're out there, you see something that maybe you don't just get to see on Street View. You could Street View all the highways I drove down, but I don't think you necessarily get the full experience of being there, seeing the passing traffic, seeing the people in their front yards, on their farm vehicles, things like that. And I think these are just really important reminders of what America is when you think about it in aggregate. If you mentioned a lot of people like in Denver and Seattle or some of these other large metros, they might mostly interact with people who have perhaps make similar amounts of money in that as they do, have similar educational backgrounds, have similar hobbies or other interests. When you're physically on the landscape, you might have almost nothing in common with somebody other than that you're both American. And so just kind of being reminded of that, I think, is an important dose in humility, that there's actually quite a big and complicated country out there if you make the effort to go see it. And that perhaps there's more than just the the social interactions and the friends that you have, the family that you have, and kind of the life you've made for yourself. There are many ways of living. There are many ways of that people have always lived here, and taking a chance to understand those a little bit better, I think was a big part of why.
So how did that give you appreciation for these more rural areas?
I think a lot of rural areas are where a lot of our food comes from, a lot of our energy comes from, a lot of our kind of natural resources come from, that a lot of times I find that folks in the city take for granted. They put their order on Amazon and expect it to arrive within 2 days if they have Prime, and they don't really consider the fact that, okay, well, what is the whole chain involved in that? Where are the distribution workers in the warehouse coming from? Where are the truck drivers who are driving cross country to make that possible? Where are they stopping for gas? Where are they sleeping at night? Think about this whole supply chain that you've kind of taken for granted. Every time you fill up your car with gas, there's a huge network that made that possible. Every time you go to the grocery store or you eat out, that food came from somewhere, and probably it came from a more rural county than an urban county. And so there's something that is important to be reminded of. It's kind of that act of humility to remind yourself that there are a lot of different places in this country where a lot of things that you use on a daily basis, you might not feel that you have much interaction with rural America, but actually there's a lot of things in rural America that very much do affect your day-to-day life.
All right, so I'm from Mobile, Alabama, in Mobile County. Can you tell me about what you remember about Mobile, if anything?
I was there. I stopped for a couple hours. I was driving east from Biloxi. I had stopped there and walked along the beach. I had seen the casinos.
Biloxi. We all know Biloxi, Mobile, because that's where you can go gamble. Exactly.
Yes, exactly. So I came to downtown Mobile. I camped out at a coffee shop. I did a little bit of work. I walked around. I was there kind of like over like lunch hour. I remember walking, waiting for the traffic light to cross some streets in downtown. I can't say I remember a whole lot more. I'm sure there are beautiful museums and restaurants there that I didn't get a chance to stop at.
There are some very pretty places. Do you remember the name of the coffee shop? Any chance?
I do not, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. I also spent 3 years in Charleston, West Virginia when I was in the Marine Corps. Another state that most people only know because it's typically the lowest on any sort of economic or educational outcomes, right? It ranks low across most of our indicators for what we consider to be success. But I remember personally my time there very fondly, and yet at the same time, I witnessed firsthand the devastation that the opioid crisis wreaked across the entire state. It just hollowed out entire towns. I saw what the mining industry was doing to a lot of the state's natural beauty, the strip mining, literally taking the tops off of mountains. Do you recall any of that? Do you remember visiting West Virginia? Do you remember Charleston at all?
Yeah, of course. I found, West Virginia to be an incredibly almost inspiring place. I think it was, like Alaska, it was just so different from most of the other places around it. And I did spend a night in Charleston. So I went to a bar that night. I went to a place called Taylor Books in the morning. And because I had been so fascinated with West Virginia, I bought a couple books about local history and things and read them when I got home. It was an interesting piece I read about how West Virginia was often treated as something of an internal colony, which I felt very much rang true, not only for West Virginia, but also the way we might treat a lot of other places, say the Permian Basin in West Texas, the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, the
You'll have to
Bakken in
explain
North
to me what the
Dakota.
Permian Basin
Yeah,
is in
yeah.
West
So
Texas.
these are all oil, natural gas,
Okay.
fracking areas around the country that I think often are described as sacrifice zones, as places where they, drill for oil and perhaps don't treat the landscape and the drinking water and the local residents very nicely, and which kind of rang true for what I had read about the history of West Virginia and the mines there, and so I found West Virginia and Charleston to be kind of interesting, but also somewhat haunting places. In addition to the kind of the inspiration and difference that I felt there, um, it really makes you question this idea of America as this kind of cohesive, um, perhaps not cohesive, but kind of urban and unified unit. West Virginia is a little bit different in a lot of ways.
Being from the South, I grew up in a fairly religious home, a religious community. But you being from Chicago, this wasn't something that was necessarily your experience. However, you write about being in the South and seeing the things that I was acclimatized to seeing on a daily basis. So billboards advertising, are you going to heaven or hell type questions, or Jesus in all capital letters, billboards about abortion, advertisements. We talk about religion in the South being in the water, basically. So what was your impression regarding religion and Christianity, I think kind of specifically, as you traveled across the United States and maybe across the South generally, and how did it strike you? Did it stand out at all?
Yeah, of course. This is a great question. I found that Christianity, one, as you already point out, was extremely visible on the landscape. Perhaps not just in the South, but in rural Alaska, definitely. In the Midwest, definitely. Even parts around the West, even in maybe a little bit less so in the Northeast. But it's very much visible. It's very much there. You can't overlook the fact that America is primarily a Christian nation. When you spend this much time traveling around it. But at the same time, I was often perplexed. I write about in my article how often the anti-abortion billboard was sitting right next to the adult store billboard that was advertising the store at the next exit. So it was a little bit tricky sometimes to understand, like, how do people here reconcile these kind of two very different things, like sitting right next to each other along the highway? And so I think there are, on the radios, I often would listen to local radio, and there's a lot of preachers, there's a lot of religious talk radio, religious music radio that I think is very easy to forget and overlook when you're in large cities. In cities, it can almost feel like we're a post-Christian nation, things like that. But I think once you get beyond the cities and the suburbs and exurbs, like it very much does reappear. I'm not expressly pro-Christian or anti-Christian. I think I was trying to observe from as neutral of a standpoint as I could that this is how a lot of people in our country really do center their lives. And I think we need, if we're going to talk about tolerance and acceptance, we need to extend that same attitude towards those who are devoutly religious.
So what do you think your travels taught you about what it means to be an American?
That's a very loaded question. I think the question of what it means to be an American is something that we have never really been able to settle. Like we are a country of immigrants and always have been for the past 250 years, and so this question is a little bit tricky to answer. I think, are you an American if you believe you're an American? Are you an American if you spent your formative years here? Are you an American if you have left a tragic situation in your home country and you have attained American citizenship or permanent residency? I don't want to necessarily say who qualifies or not, but I think this is a question that we do need to have a national conversation about. I think it's sort of a tricky third rail kind of topic, but I do think there's a lot that we could learn, and I think if we're willing to have this conversation as a country, perhaps the next 10 years, immigration is obviously a very difficult topic politically right now, could go a little bit better if we're not afraid of kind of having this conversation in the open, as opposed to amongst the extremists on either side who are yelling at each other on Twitter and other social media platforms. I don't think the loudest voices in the room are necessarily right about this. I think often a lot of people are much closer to the middle.
I'm gonna push you a little bit on this, because I think that's a great answer, but and all of those things are going on, and we can sort of debate theoretically endlessly what it means to be an American. But you've already talked about how across the course of your travels you moderated your political beliefs, and so in some ways some people would say you became less liberal, or you became more conservative, or you moved toward the center. So do you think you did those things, or do you think you became more conservative, or do you think you became more American? And what's the difference between, how do you differentiate between those two?
That's really interesting. I would definitely say I became more American. I think I had a chance to experience America in all of its glory and faults. I think when you grow up in two places that think very similarly, and have most of your social interactions with people who maybe are more familiar to you, you lose out on some of what it means to be an American in kind of the full sense of the word, not just Americans that are like me, Americans who have lived here and whose families have lived here for centuries, right? So I think perhaps part of being an American maybe can or should be having respect for people on the other side of the political spectrum. I think if we're going to make a diverse, multiracial democracy work, we need more people who are not afraid of the other side.
But as we've talked about today, it's one thing to have respect for the other side. It's a whole nother thing to travel to where they live, to travel to where their patterns of life are, to spend time with them, to order coffee from them, to pump gas at their gas stations, right? That is a completely different thing, isn't it? Than just, quote, having respect for the other side. Because we've been saying, let's have respect for the other side for the past 20 or 30 years. And the more we say, let's have respect for the other side, the more we see the polarization in the United States increase at a similar rate.
I'm not going to debate anything you said. I think that, it is different physically being there. I think, as we've already talked about, creating that sense of humanization and empathy is very much what you get as part of this. If I can challenge anyone listening, you don't have to travel to every county to have this effect. You can just go to the other side of your state, where maybe people who you think you have nothing in common with live, and just spend a weekend trying to either break bread with people who are different from you. I'm not quite sure what the correct answer is here, or where you're pushing me, but I do think that's something small. Take a weekend of your time to humanize your fellow Americans. I don't think that's too much to ask of almost anybody.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Okay, as we get toward wrapping up, I'd like to just go through a quick lightning round. What was the most beautiful moment of your travels?
I think when I was flying back from Adak, Alaska, which is in the West Aleutians borough of Alaska, we were flying back along the Aleutian Islands chain. There were giant volcanoes you could see below the clouds, and it really just struck me how huge America is. There were no signs of human habitation on this landscape. That it was a real moment of humility for me to see just how small I was in this giant country. There was just a beauty about that I will never forget.
Okay, what was the saddest moment of your travels?
Yeah, I think there were some really tough days driving across, say, Native American reservations. I can think of a day in South Dakota when I was tuning into the local radio station. I was seeing, the poverty very evident on the landscape, and it was really a sad moment to see that, the original stewards of this land that I have, was lucky enough to travel across, just really are struggling in their day-to-day lives, and that really did hit me.
What expectations did you have going into this exploration that turned out to be inaccurate?
I think I maybe didn't think I was going to become less liberal or more American. I think that really did strike me by surprise. I thought I was going to do this and come back feeling about the same person as I was before. I didn't quite realize the magnitude of what I was getting myself into and how it really would affect my kind of personal life and political beliefs and things like that.
So what's next? Are you going to travel anywhere next? What are you working on?
Well, I managed to miss 2 national parks
Okay.
On my travels, so those are high on my list. I
Which
would
two?
like to Katmai in Alaska and Hawaii volcanoes on the Big Island. I'd also like to travel to every territory. There are only 5. I'm not going to try to go to every municipio in Puerto Rico, but I think visiting all 5 territories would be a worthwhile goal because they are part of America. They might not get to vote in presidential elections, but these are our fellow Americans as well.
Well, Danny, thanks so much for being on the podcast. Thanks for talking with me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank
Cheers.
you, Jean-Luc.
And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that we're recording in the historic Denver Press Club, the oldest press club in the country. And this podcast is produced in association and in deep partnership. We are very, very grateful to New Motion, a production company that is doing some really great things. So Danny will have an article published in the July edition of the Hart and the Currie magazine. You can find it at www.thehartandthecurrie.com. That is HART and Currie, CUR. So thehartandthecurrie.com. Thanks again, Danny.
Thank you, Jean-Luc.